afternoon. This is the November 18th edition of the Global News Review from the Tennessee World Affairs Council. I'm Patrick Ryan, and I'm joined by Ambassador Dick Bowers and Dr. Breck Walker. Hello, gentlemen.
Hiya.
Hi, Pat.
Glad to see everyone here today. We had a great show last week with guest host Tim Douglas. We thank Tim for joining us. He talked about Bolivia, and we had a great conversation, including a little excursion into the international nature of the Masters golf tournament. I don't think, Breck, I don't know if you followed that. I missed it this weekend, but I'm not sure if a global player won the tournament or an American guy.
No, Dustin Johnson won, who's an American guy whose fiance is Wayne Gretzky's daughter. And Dustin Johnson is the #1 ranked golfer in the world. So he played like it.
Wayne Gretzky. Well, there's an international connection there.
That's right.
And before we get into our news review today, I wanted to mention we're hearing very good news about vaccines for COVID, and we'll be talking about that in coming weeks, what the prospects are. And we've talked in the past about the international nature of the distribution of vaccines now that it looks like we're on the doorstep to getting those out to people. But I suppose we need to all continue to keep up the good work on hygiene, masks, and distance, and avoiding social gatherings and all that. I know Ambassador Bowers is as scrupulous on those things as anybody could possibly be. Let's start off today with our quiz question. And Breck, if you want to take that.
Sure, Pat. This week's U.S. Institute of Peace question of the week is the following. The rapidity of the escalation of violence between Tigray and Addis Ababa is concerning in itself, given the stakes for this country's peace and stability. This conflict has the potential to quickly become more polarized and increase violence throughout society. And what country is this? And the possible answers are A, Eritrea, B, Ethiopia, C, Sudan, and D, Somalia. And we'll talk about the answer to that at the end of the program.
Terrific. Let's jump right in with our first topic. Actually, I don't want to shortcut the ambassador. Dick, if you want to read our topics for the week, and then we'll get going.
Sure, because you've got a word in there that I think is kind of cool. So the first topic is going to be the White House transition, global reactions, and Jiggery-Pokery. So Pat will explain what Jiggery-Pokery is all about. Second, there's been a massive Mammoth Asia-Pacific trade deal, and America is on the outside of it, looking in. And Breck is going to talk about that. And then Peru has had some presidency problems, musical chairs in Lima, and I'll take that one.
Okay, great. Well, let's take a look at the global reactions and this new word that we're fond of, Jiggery-Pokery. We can actually thank Ambassador Thomas Pickering for that when he was in our webinar of the Election 2020 conversation about America's place in the world. He shared that word. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it's in a dictionary, and it basically means shenanigans. So we're looking at some of the shenanigans going on in this transitional period. Two things that I want to note at the start here. First, the Tennessee World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan organization, and we do not support political agendas. Second, global developments frequently overlap with U.S. domestic politics. It's difficult to say the word Trump without someone thinking that you're about to say something on one side or the other. But we don't want to avoid addressing these important international and national security issues. They're important understanding America's position and role in the world. So let's take a look at the topic. We're going to briefly go through a few aspects of the transition and basically the stalemate in the government, which is affecting national security and the preparations of the incoming Biden team. The GSA is the key institution there, and a couple of the implications are in the area of COVID, which is a national security threat. The global pandemic affects many aspects of our foreign policy, as well as our domestic security. It's also affecting another key aspect of governance, and that's intelligence for the new team. We'll talk a little bit about the Pentagon, the personnel changes, the troop withdrawals, and turn to the maximum pressure campaign on Iran and the effect overseas and the American sharing of democratic values. We talked last week a little bit about the reaction around the world to the election of President Biden, and we're going to get into some more of that in the coming weeks as the transition rolls out. But what we wanted to cover today are basically the implications of what's going on in the transition, and as widely reported, it's the control of the GSA administrator, in this case, Emily Murphy, to give the green light for support to the president-elect and his team. That includes security clearances to access critical information, the spaces to operate the transition team in Washington, and budget to cover transition expenses. And also the green light for the incoming teams to deploy around the government to coordinate with the current Trump administration officials. And Ms. Murphy has yet to turn on the support. There are still some court cases going on, but even as many in the Republican side have said, it's time to move on. Senator James Lankford last week said that if the green light wasn't given, he was going to get involved, but then he walked that back a little bit. But I think it's everyone is in agreement that the Biden administration needs to get the intelligence briefs, needs to get coordination with the COVID-19 team in place, and move on. So where does that hurt national security the most? In the area of COVID-19, the development and distribution of vaccines, preparation to get that distribution moving along as quickly and as efficiently as possible, and also the need to have a seamless handoff to deal with the public health catastrophe. In the area of intelligence, valuable time is being lost for the incoming national security team to get up to speed on worldwide threats, operations underway by the U.S., clandestine programs, and the myriad tasks that will have to be accomplished on day one when the Biden administration takes office. In the area of the Pentagon and other national security aspects of the transition, we've seen a shuffling at the top, the leadership by President Trump. Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, was fired in a tweet from the president, and we know that Esper was reluctant to deploy active duty military troops against protesters in Washington a couple of months ago, and that reportedly angered President Trump. He also pushed back against the precipitous troop drawdowns from Afghanistan and Iraq, and against military strikes against Iran. And we're seeing that unfolding this week with his replacement. So on November 9th, President Trump fired Esper summarily via tweet. Esper has been replaced by acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller, and he formerly was the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, a recent addition to that position. But he's also had in his background the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel who was in the Special Forces, so he's got experience in the military, but he's been widely criticized as not really having the background to prepare him to run the Pentagon. In addition to firing Esper and moving in Miller, the president also fired Mark Tome, the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So this is the primary policy position in the Pentagon. Also fired in that action was James Anderson, the acting policy chief. So the two two top people responsible for policy in the Pentagon were out, and a spokesman within the government said that the president is taking back control of DOD, that it's a rebirth of foreign policy. This is Trump foreign policy. And the individual spoke anonymously with the press. The personnel changes, he claimed, would clear the way for a more loyal Pentagon apparatus to carry out Trump's goals, including the last-minute withdrawal of troops from foreign conflicts. Well, the president has the authority to do whatever he wants in the Pentagon, and firing Esper and the policy staff seems to have simply been to make sure that there was no pushback against what he intended to do in his last 2 months in office. Those explanations are at odds with explanation or comments around Washington that the moves were designed primarily to punish dissent in the Pentagon. So in place of the policy people in the Pentagon, they announced that Mr. Anthony Tata is being put in place as the acting Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So he is now in position to take that role as the principal policy individual. Normally the deputy would have moved up, but he was fired as well. So Anthony Tata, a former Army Brigadier General who became a novelist and then a Fox News commentator, is now the policy chief of the Pentagon. He was criticized previously for some of his positions, including certain comments that were labeled Islamophobic when he was up for approval by the Senate Armed Services Committee for the position that he's now been moved into in an acting role. He's known to have pushed conspiracy theories on Twitter that former CIA Director John Brennan sought to overthrow Trump and even to have him assassinated. So he's a colorful guy, and he's now the principal policy chief in the Pentagon. Elsewhere in government, the president announced the firing of Christopher Krebs, who was the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and directly tied it to Krebs' statement that there were no infractions in the election, and reports of fraud allegations were untrue. And President Trump had previously tweeted that those allegations were wrong. And then in Krebs' firing by tweet, the president repeated that there were widespread fraudulent activities in the election. So continuing intrigue on the personnel front in terms of what's going on with the transition and the final days of the Trump administration. The other concern is reports that President Trump asked what his options were for attacking Iran and its a nuclear program. There was a report that Iran continues to compile fissile material, and this is in violation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. President Trump removed the United States from that agreement in 2018, and since then, the United States has instituted what's been called a maximum pressure campaign against Iran. So Iran, in response to that, has been violating the limits on their compiling fissile material, and that was recently reported. So the president talked to his advisors about attacking an Iranian nuclear facility, and that raised concerns at the Pentagon that there could be, the U.S. could be drawn into a wider war in response to that attack. And you may remember, Dick and Breck, that back in January, the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Republican Guard Force, and Iran didn't hesitate to respond to that provocation by launching surface-to-surface missiles at bases in Iraq where U.S. personnel were stationed, and some 100 plus Americans were injured in that activity. Lastly, I would just comment that the United States is not showing its best face in how our democratic systems are operating, and the State Department and other organs of the government have long since pushed the democratic values around the world. We've monitored elections around the world, and this is kind of hollowing out that policy of supporting democracy around the world, when we apparently have so many difficulties associated with our presidential elections, and the transition of power peacefully, as has been a hallmark of the United States. So a lot to chew on there. I hope I didn't take too much of our time, fellas, but I welcome your observations on what's going on with the transition, the holdup in getting the Biden team in place, the Jiggery-Pokery in the Pentagon, and our impact around the world, including the situation vis-a-vis Iran and other potential hotspots.
Hey, well, Pat, I wanted to say one. I just wanted to say one thing. Maybe it would be for next week, but I'd like to have us look into the etymology of Jiggery-Pokery and find out exactly where that comes from. But one thing that I thought was interesting is, of course, Trump was thinking about, but hasn't yet fired Christopher Wray, the FBI director, or Gina Haspel, the CIA director. And I'm wondering if that may be in part because, he's accepting his defeat at the end of the day in his own mind, and maybe he is positioning himself to run in 2024, and he is thinking about what would be considered a political misstep in that regard. Do you have a thought about that?
Well, the ambassador's shaking his head. Go ahead, Dick.
No, I think Trump is a wily character, and he's going to try to figure out what's best for him, and the idea that he could change some political comeback down the road. But he also, part of his character is that he's a very vindictive person, and somebody sort of in his mind crosses him, doesn't show loyalty, he will lash out and try to do everything to destroy that individual. So there's a balance between how does he set himself up for a political career in 2024 with, I'm not going to take it from these guys that are starting to leave the ship and leave me alone in this activity. But I would hope that some of the better angels of Mr. Trump and his colleagues would say, hey, the country deserves a good transition, as good as we can get, and would get on with it and tell the lady who's running the GSA to pull the plug. And there's a word that they use, certification.
Ascertain.
Yeah, and issue that and let the Biden people go to work.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the transition, there was a criticism in the 9/11 report that the transition in 2000, the election of 2000, was a factor in the Bush administration not being prepared to analyze and assess and deal with the growing threat from Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And you may, I know you guys remember that the big difference in that.
Yeah, big difference in that, Pat, was it was not known who won the election. There's no doubt who won the election now. And,
right. It wasn't motivated maliciously.
No, we're not sure who won, and it wasn't until the final decision of the court got involved, because it was one state, Florida, that could have tipped the balance one way or the other.
Right. So this is a different situation in terms of motivation to hold up the transition, but it's illustrative to consider the impact on a new administration from not having this full time. And if you consider the amount of time that people have to get from election day to inauguration, with the increasing complexity of the United States government for domestic affairs in the middle of a pandemic, and also the international scene is not hitting the pause button. And a lot of these actors out there are taking advantage of this gap between, apparently the reports are that President Trump is doing little in terms of his day-to-day workload and carrying out his duties. So the next 2 months are a perilous time for our national security.
You're right.
Okay, let's talk about another important topic with Breck taking the lead. Dr. Walker, you're going to talk with us about the economic partnership, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia. And the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Pat. Well, Pat and Dick, the largest free trade area in the world came into existence last weekend, spearheaded by China. The U.S. wasn't a part of it. We weren't invited to be a part of it. In fact, it's the first time in the post-war period that the United States has not been at the center of a major global free trade agreement. And it brings to mind, what's the phrase, if pigs could fly? Well, the pigs are flying right now. On Sunday, 15 countries in the Asia-Pacific region completed negotiations that began way back in 2012, and they signed a trade agreement that encompassed over 2 billion people and represents about 1/3 of the world economy. Now, the signatories are Australia, China, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and then the 10 ASEAN countries, which I'll just run through them quickly, and there may be a slide in there as well. But Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Now, the pact is meant to reduce trade barriers and make it easier for these regional neighbors to do business with one another. Now, I don't want and the pact is called the RCEP. I don't want to overstate the significance of this agreement. I mean, lots of folks out there are saying that the agreement is more smoke than fire, that it's more symbolic than substantive, that it doesn't cut tariffs all that much, at least initially, that it doesn't cover most agricultural products, for example. It does not mandate common labor or environmental standards, as some of the other major trade agreements have. And, you know, those folks who think that it's more symbolic think that it's kind of a tidying up, that it's bringing these various bilateral free trade agreements that these 15 nations have, that it's bringing these agreements under one sort of overarching agreement. And as well, 9 of the 15 nations, their legislatures are going to have to ratify the agreement before it takes effect. And that, you know, that may take some time. However, lots of others think that this agreement is another example of China on the rise in that region and the U.S. on the decline in terms of regional influence, that the agreement is going to serve as a building block in a new world order for Asia where China is going to be calling the shots. There's a quote from one senior EU lawmaker, and this is the quote: "The European Union and the U.S. should see the new Asia-Pacific Trade Pact as a wake-up call for joint action against the growing influence of China." And The Economist magazine said, the trade pact more closely ties the economic fortunes of the signatory countries to that of China and will, over time, pull these countries deeper into the economic and political orbit of China. So this agreement marks the first multilateral trade deal for China. It marks the first bilateral tariff reduction arrangement between Japan and China. And it's the first time that China, Japan, and South Korea have been in a single free trade agreement. So this is crossed and broken through a lot of lines here in terms of trade arrangements between Asian Pacific countries. The biggest immediate impact is probably going to be on supply chains, because one thing the agreement definitely does is it allows products that have parts from different countries. It cuts through a lot of the red tape and does cut down tariff and custom time on those situations. So it's really going to be an incentive for companies that are using supply chains to manufacture products to use countries that are part of this trade pact, because they avoid a lot of red tape and lower customs duties and the like as a result of doing that. But in all events, most people do think that the RCEP, this trade agreement, will accelerate a shift in global trade toward East Asia and away from the West. Now, why would our allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, serious allies that we have treaties with, why would they join up for this? And the answer is, and I'm certainly not the only one that thinks this, but the answer is there was really no other good alternative. The United States decided not to participate in a competing free trade agreement, which would have excluded China, at least for a time, and would have made China conform to common standards on the labor and environmental front if they had later decided to join at some point. And maybe just a very brief little history here will bring this into focus. Towards the end of the Obama administration, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, was negotiated. And it was going to be, or was, a free agreement, a free trade agreement among 11 Pacific Rim economies and the United States. And I think we have a slide showing who the participants in the TPP were. The TPP was supposed to be an alternative to this free trade region that is now anchored by China. However, TPP, pushed by the Obama administration and signed by the United States, but needing legislative approval, the TPP became a political football in the 2016 election, and both President Trump and Hillary Clinton opposed it, and so it never went before Congress after Trump was elected. Now, the remaining members, minus the U.S. Of the TPP, went on to form something called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or simply known as CPTPP. But it failed, obviously, to include the two biggest economies in the world, the United States and China. Alongside of that, the Trump administration began pursuing this protectionist trade policy that was based on bilateral negotiations, and he was often used tariffs and other trade barriers as a negotiating tactic. And under these circumstances, these Asian nations saw benefit in joining the Chinese free trade deal, the RCEP. And so how does China benefit from this? Well, there's economic benefit to China and to these other nations that have also joined the RCEP. There's economic benefit, though, to China that likely will lead to geopolitical advantage. And meaning that if South Korea and Japan and maybe even Australia are doing well trading with the countries within the RCEP, that undoubtedly, it could weaken our alliances and relations over time. In the first half of the year, ASEAN overtook the European Union as China's biggest trading partner, and the RCEP will accelerate that. And then this agreement also gives a propaganda benefit to China in that China can now claim in its region that they are more committed to free trade than the United States is. And free trade is the lifeblood of Asian economies. The Chinese prime minister said, quote, "The RCEP is a victory of multilateralism and free trade, an array of light and hope amid the clouds." So the Biden administration is going to have a decision to make. ASEAN members are concerned about Chinese domination in the region, and many of those members hope that the Biden administration will re-engage on some basis. President Obama pursued the TPP doggedly in hopes of continuing to assert a U.S. economic presence in the region. But offsetting the hope that the Biden administration will re-engage, I suspect, is the fear that the U.S. is no longer a consistent ally or friend. That in its big picture policies, and particularly trade and security with and for allies, that we're no longer consistent in that regard. China now supports free trade while the U.S. has adopted an in quotations mark, fair trade strategy in a region fully supportive of free trade and very suspicious of protectionist tactics such as tariffs. And Americans may secure economic benefits in the near term following this diplomatic strategy, but I think that there will be a price to pay in terms of influence. And Trump's team is saying, of course, that he's going to run again in 2024. So it will be no easy task for a Biden administration to get South Korea, Japan, Australia, much less the ASEAN nations, to unite against China if China plays its cards right. So Pat, I'll stop there. Hope I didn't run over.
No, that was terrific. Thanks, Breck. I think this is an important development in our global economic situation, and it really has been overshadowed by other reports, the pandemic, et cetera. So I don't think very many Americans really have appreciated what's going on in trade. We're losing ground in our relationship with Asian Pacific countries, and these are important signals being sent. I think you pointed out there's a marginal benefit to this trade pact, but the political benefit accruing to China by these relations in the United States, frankly, shooting itself in the foot with the TPP, it became a political football that nobody really understood what was involved. But most analysts saw it as really beneficial to the United States. It gave the U.S. almost all of the bargaining positions that were asked for, given our economic dominance. But it kept China out of that pact, and we were in. So we've got work to do, mending the relationships with our East Asian and Pacific friends.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what strategy China has going forward, because as we were talking about before the program got underway, they've been very aggressive in territorial matters in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And that has certainly provoked serious security concerns. And Pat, you mentioned that Japan and Australia have entered into a historic defense pact recently because of those security concerns. But if China decides that it's going to use soft power going forward and lightens up on the territorial ambitions, and it may not do that, but it's got a real advantage here that I think will result in geopolitical benefits to them and greater influence in the region if they can just tone down the military aspects of things. But maybe that's not in their DNA.
So how would the U.S. go about re-engaging in this area, with these countries now having signed the agreement with China in the lead? So Mr. Biden, who I think is an internationalist and believes in free and fair trade, how would the U.S. resurrect the TPP?
Now, the TPP is still, now it's called the CPTPP, but it's still in existence with the other nations.
So we would just adhere to it?
Well, or join it. And again, that would be a politically gutsy thing, I suspect, for the Biden administration to do. But there are many people and some Asian nations hoping that the Biden administration will re-up and give serious thought to rejoining.
Well, Pat, your point about being a political football when it was out there, I mean, this really presaged, I think our president is a master at being able to take issues and politicize them and polarize them to a point where, he can rally many of his supporters to go out and say, this is a horrible deal, kind of like face masks, which to me are as apolitical as you could get, but it's turned out otherwise right now. So
yeah, well, I think the death of the TPP was the 2016 election. It was a football that Hillary Clinton couldn't even resist the impact, the political impact of saying that this was not in America's interest. There was a lot of pressure from trade groups and manufacturing and unions, et cetera. And just to sort out some of the acronym soup here for our friends, TPP was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And when we bowed out of that, the remaining partners signed what was called the CPTPP, and that translates to Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it basically latched on to all of the negotiations that had previously been done and joined them together. Largely, I think, with the leadership of Japan in getting that done, and it gave concrete advantage to those countries, but the United States was sitting on the outside looking in.
And again, it's such a reverse for the United States to be in a protectionist mode, at least under the Trump administration, and for China all of a sudden to be recognized by its neighbors as, at least economically speaking, a little bit of a beacon of light supporting free trade.
And what happened to
Yeah.
the free trading Republican Party?
Yeah.
Same thing that happened to the Republican Party. It's not there anymore, except in name.
Jiggery-Pokery.
Well, I think, Breck, you mentioned the defense agreement between Japan and Australia, and that is an important move. You know, we talked about the quadrilateral agreement between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. And a component of that now is this agreement between Japan and Australia, where Australian forces can use naval bases in Japan for their ships and supplies and rest stops, et cetera. So that's an important development in the expansion of this quadrilateral agreement. So there's a lot going on in the Pacific. I hope that we'll be able to bring more of it to our friends here, because it is significant to American security and prosperity. Jiggery-Pokery and all.
I've had all the acronyms I can stand for the day, though, I think.
Okay, well, the big one this week was RCEP. So thanks, Breck, for sharing with that. Maybe SOS, I don't know. Ambassador Bowers, we're going to talk about Peru.
Sí, señor, el Peru.
And over to you.
Okay, well, there's a lot of political instability going on in Peru these days. Over a week ago, the Peruvian Congress removed the popular presidential incumbent, a guy named Martin Vizcarra, and they did so by using an archaic constitutional clause that allows the Congress to declare the president, quote, morally incapable to lead the nation. Now, that's just in Peru that they have that clause, but I don't think other countries do. Well, it then went on to shock the nation last Tuesday, a week ago, by swearing in the head of Congress, a man named Martin Merino, to replace him. Now, these moves triggered massive demonstrations throughout the country, led mostly by younger Peruvians who saw Congress's actions as a ruthless power grab by lawmakers. And then the police hard-handed response to the protesters, including the heavy use of tear gas and rubber bullets at close range, only deepened the discontent. And by last weekend, the New York Times had reported that 41 people had, quote, gone missing during the protests, and 112 had been wounded, and several deaths were confirmed also. Then 2 days ago, on Sunday, after most of his cabinet had resigned, the interim president, Mr. Merino, after only 6 days on the job, had had enough and announced his irrevocable resignations. So Peruvians woke up yesterday, Monday morning, without a president and braced for the prospect of living under a fifth president in but 5 years. Later that same day, the Congress announced the appointment of that new president, the first-term member of Congress, 76-year-old Francisco Sagasti, who has the distinction of becoming the third president in but 1 week of political turmoil in Peru. So what's going on in Peru to cause all this political unrest? Well, early last year, Peru looked like it had turned a corner. Thrust into office when political scandal toppled then President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski in 2018, Mr. Vizcarra responded with straight talk and a sweeping reform agenda, and promptly soared in the polls. Despite the political roller coaster that was going on, the economy remained remarkably stable and unscathed. Millions of Peruvians were being lifted out of poverty through years of economic growth fueled primarily by mining and agricultural exports. And Peru really was a rare bright spot in a mostly stagnating Latin America. But then the coronavirus hit. And President at that time, Vizcarra, ordered one of Latin America's first and strictest lockdowns. He also rolled out one of the region's biggest economic aid packages to help citizens stay at home and social distance. But it did not work. And Peru, a country of 33 million people, has been devastated by the coronavirus with one of the world's highest disease mortality rates, a projected 14% drop in gross domestic product, with spiking debt and a fiscal sinkhole. Despite massive energy stimulus, poverty in Peru could reach 30% this year. So my take is Peru's crisis traces to small bore ambitions of the current unicameral Congress, which is splintered into 9 parties, none of which garnered more than 11% of the popular vote in the last election. And many in that Congress really owe their seats to Mr. Vizcarra, because after clashing repeatedly with obstructionist lawmakers last year, he dissolved the Congress in September 2019 and called new elections. The new Congress, seated in January 2020, promptly turned on him, and now the streets have turned on his short-lived successor, Mr. Moreno. So where does all this leave us? It leaves us with major political form being needed, including the establishment of vibrant, functioning, and capable political parties, which Peru does not have. And it also has massive corruption. I think something like 68 of the 130 legislators in the Congress are under investigation for either criminal activity, corruption, or doing things they shouldn't be doing. So in the meantime, late Sunday night, Mr. Vizcarra added to the turmoil by claiming that the current Congress, which has the authority under the Constitution to appoint the next president, he says that this Congress is too discredited to select Mr. Moreno's replacement. And he's asked the nation's top court to weigh in on the legality of his removal, a move that he could potentially use to stage a political comeback. So stay tuned. I predict in the short run, more turmoil and instability, and in the long run, who knows? Questions?
Okay, Dick, the so what question. What's the impact on relationships with the United States from Peru? I think we're concerned about the preservation of democracy, the stability of countries in Latin America. Anything else come to mind about
Well,
our
I
interests
think
there?
to a certain extent, certainly for the last 4 years, Latin America has been ignored, except for the possibility of maybe looking once in a while at Cuba and Venezuela and shaking a big stick at them. But otherwise, our policies have been benign at best and just totally indifferent. I think we need to re-engage in Latin America again and start standing up for the things that our country used to stand up for: the rule of law, democracy, proper fiscal policies, things of that sort.
Well, we had a brief last week from Tim Douglas on Bolivia and the return of socialism to Bolivia. So that's an interesting development in a continent that had largely gone in the other direction.
Yeah, but you know, these words, one of the problems we have is that we don't have common understanding of what these words mean. What is Bolivian socialism? Bolivian socialism is capitalism, but with a heavy dose of taking care of the population, of using government to uplift the poor people of the country. It is not classic socialism where we pool all of our resources and give to everybody, and it's certainly not communism. Evo Morales is basically discredited. I don't know if that came out in your discussion last week, but he'll come back and play a minor role, but he overplayed his hand, so he's going to kind of be gone. In Peru, it's a little bit like many people in the United States voted for Joe Biden because they didn't want Donald Trump. And many people may have voted for Donald Trump because they didn't want Joe Biden. So you there was a Peruvian president, Fujimori, who overplayed his hand by trying to stay around for a third 5-year term and was finally kicked out. But Peru has a history of changing presidents very quickly. And that's basically because the political instability of not having any institutionalized party. So every time there's an election, there's a different party that shows up, people adhere to that party, and then they immediately dissolve it and go away. So there's no real kind of institutional loyalty to the political and democratic process.
Yeah, wasn't Fujimori deposed and imprisoned or charged with high crimes?
He was, and he went to Japan, and his daughter was active in recent years in Peru, in the political scene. But Fujimori is gone, and then Alan Garcia, who was the president in 2018, I believe, he was about to get arrested, and the police were coming to get him, and he committed suicide because of his corruption and not willing to stand up and take the medicine for his deeds. So it's an interesting place.
Yes, to be sure. I think we will hopefully keep more attention to the situation in Latin America because it is important. And as you note, we seem to be confined with our relationship with Cuba and Venezuela.
Yeah.
And despite the bluster a year ago in doing something about Venezuela, the situation has not gotten any better, and the exodus of Venezuelans continues to be a crisis situation for many of its neighbors. All right. I don't see any questions from our attendees, so we will, excuse me, move on to our closing question of the week answer. And Breck, do you want to illuminate us on this topic that you discussed in great detail, the situation in Tigray?
Right. The question was, again, which country that has as its capital Addis Ababa is sending military forces into its northern region of Tigray in an escalating, I guess you'd have to call it more than a conflict at this point. And the answer is B, Ethiopia, which we did talk about last week or the week before.
Terrific. Thanks for that. And just a reminder that if you want to get the quiz every Monday morning, sign up for the newsletter at tnwac.org. And while you're there, become a member of the World Affairs Council. That's how we afford Ambassador Bowers bespoke outfits that he wears on our programs. But seriously, if you're a supporter of global awareness, education in our schools and in our community, we appreciate you becoming a member of the World Affairs Council or making a financial gift. Let me note that next week we will not be here. We will be observing Thanksgiving Eve. So the next Global News Review will be on December the 2nd, I believe that is, Wednesday of that week at 1 p.m. We'll be back. And I remind you that you can sign up for that now. It's on our calendar, tnwac.org/calendar. And you can also register for a special program we have coming up on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations called UN 75, The Journey Continues. Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who shared with us Jiggery-Pokery, will be the keynote speaker. And we will also have a panel including the former French ambassador to the United States, Gerard Araud, who was the permanent representative of France to the United Nations, as was Ambassador Pickering on behalf of the United States. So we'll have some other panelists, including the chief archivist from the Truman Library, to talk about the origins of the United Nations, and some other panelists. But please take a look at the calendar to see more about the background of those individuals, and that will be a great program on December 9th, and you can sign up for that now. And just keep on your calendar, January 28th, we'll have a special global town hall on U.S.-Korea relations. And of course, you can tune in on Tuesday evenings for Global Nashville with Carl Dean. He'll be talking with the Chief Operating Officer of Alliance Bernstein on December the 8th. So take a look at the calendar, and please continue to enjoy these broadcasts. We are pleased to bring them to you. And Dick, Breck, any closing comments?
Breck, did you look up Jiggery-Pokery?
I will look it up. I'll be ready for it the week after next. That'll probably draw a bigger audience. But happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yes, indeed. Happy Thanksgiving to you.
And to all, please be safe. There's some special advisories out about gathering, so use your best judgment in observing the public health warnings, and do have a safe Thanksgiving. Gentlemen, great program. Thanks for your insights and perspectives and analysis of what's going on in the world. And that's it for today. Everybody be safe out there.